Welcome back to our series. We're grateful you're here. Before we introduce today's session, I'd like to remind you that you can find our updated programming in our newsletter on the web. Just Google Johns Hopkins Greenberg Bladder Cancer Institute. Thanks to Stephanie Cooper Greenberg, we have a recent newsletter full of novel updates from our institute. Additionally, I wanted to draw your attention to our group of programs specifically tailored around the experiences of women with bladder cancer, developed and led by Drs. Armin Smith and Jeannie Hoffman-Sensis and the program team of Pamela Getz, Samantha Rockler, and Stephanie Cooper Greenberg. In November, please join Drs. Nirvish Singla, Jeannie Hoffman-Sensis, and Derek Fine for a discussion around kidney health, upper tract urothelial cancer, and bladder cancer, how they are or are not related. That will be on November 21st. Again, all of these are up on our website, and if we can help you directly, we are only an email away at bladdercancer@jhmi.edu. I'm glad that you all are with us today for a conversation with Dr. Noah Hahn about clinical trials. We couldn't be in better hands. As you all know, in addition to leading a number of high-impact clinical trials here at Hopkins, Noah is internationally respected for his leadership in this field. Noah is a medical oncologist who is focused on caring for patients with bladder cancer. He earned his MD from Indiana University School of Medicine and completed his residency in internal medicine at Duke University School of Medicine before returning to Indiana to perform a fellowship in medical oncology. He then joined the faculty there and rose to the ranks to become the leader of their GU medical oncology program. And he also served as the chief scientific officer for the Hoosier Medical Oncology Network. It's called HCRN now. Very well-known cancer research organization that evaluates innovative and promising approaches to cancer treatment. Noah is also a member of the Bladder Cancer Task Force for the National Cancer Institute's Genitourinary Cancer Steering Committee and is chair of the Bladder Cancer Subcommittee for the Eastern Cooperative Oncology Group, or ECOG. For those of you who have heard Noah in the past, you will know that he enjoys the interaction of conversation in these sessions. So I would ask for the attendees to put their questions directly in the chat, and I will collate them and pose them directly to Noah. Please welcome Dr. Noah Hahn.
Hi there, David. Thanks again for having me in this forum. It's always a pleasure to be here, and thanks, Wasim, for pulling this together on the back end of the AV. I know there's a ton of preparation that goes into this. For those joining us today who've been on when I've been on before, I try to do this a little bit more informal, a little bit of high energy, high positivity, but I'd like to bring some new information and things to light for our audience, and then have questions and answers at the end. Today, I'm going to focus a little bit on clinical trials, but I'm going to talk about some new clinical trial results that have been announced in the last, well, actually now we're looking at the last 3 to 4 months, actually, not even a year, that are new since the last time I was on this forum, to make the audience aware of them, and then also to sort of start a dialogue about what this will mean for the future of the clinical trials landscape across all stages of disease. But before we do that, I do want to take one moment just for a little bit of a serious thought, just to acknowledge, those in the world right now that are facing incredible conflicts, suffering, and pain. There's a lot of things going on in the world right now, and sometimes it's not always positive, but I think we do need to sort of acknowledge that for a second. Our cancer patients face this every day. I think in the last, 3-4 days, we've seen conflicts erupt now, in Israel and Gaza, which I think is, hit a lot of people, family and otherwise. But there are a lot of places in the world that conflicts still continue, including Ukraine, Russia, Ethiopia, Sudan, the Eastern African countries, Nigeria, Myanmar, and there's been ongoing conflicts and drug war in Mexico as well. So I just want to, and those are just some that come to the list that I looked up today in terms of where things are going on. There's many more. So I just want to take 1 second to pause and just to remember those that are there, both the good people on both sides of the fences that are caught in the middle of this. Thank you. Hopefully we'll have some good news to follow. It looks like it may be a long time in some of these areas, but there's hope in every part of the world. So I'm going to switch gears and then let's talk a little bit about clinical trials in terms of in the cancer forum here. And I'm going to talk about two clinical trials that have resulted in the last 3 months for urothelial cancer, both of which were conducted in metastatic urothelial cancer patients. The first study that I'm going to talk about was called the Checkmate 901 trial. This was a large randomized trial in chemo-naive metastatic urothelial cancer patients. Sometimes, when you see a lot of us talk on the podium or read press releases, you'll sometimes hear this called the frontline metastatic setting. That essentially means patients with metastatic disease who have not received a treatment for their metastatic disease. And in the Checkmate 901 trial, there was a press release that came out in late July, which announced positive findings for a portion of their study. So the Checkmate 901 trial was a large trial, 1,290 patients, and they randomly assigned patients to one of 3 treatment arms. The standard arm, which was the control that the experimental arms would be compared to, was standard chemotherapy. And that could be with cisplatin gemcitabine or carboplatin gemcitabine. One of the arms enrolled patients to a combination of chemotherapy plus the immune checkpoint inhibitor nivolumab. Same chemo backbones as the control arm, so they could get cisplatin gemcitabine or carboplatin gemcitabine, but with the addition of the nivolumab treatment. And then there was also a third arm that did not involve chemotherapy, but looked at the combination of 2 immune therapy medicines, ipilimumab and nivolumab. The press release that came out in July announced that in patients who were cisplatin eligible, that the combination of chemotherapy plus nivolumab produced an improvement in overall survival and progression-free survival for those patients. So we've been using this term cisplatin eligible and ineligible for probably 30 years now for urothelial cancer clinical trials. One might argue this is sort of an arbitrary term that is based more on factors not unique to their cancer, but that affect our ability and safety to give certain agents. And the most common factor that determines whether someone is eligible for cisplatin or not is renal function or kidney function. So it's interesting in this trial, the trial enrolled almost 1,300 patients, and it enrolled patients who were eligible for cisplatin as well as those who were ineligible for cisplatin. The trial across the entire population, if you look at the cisplatin ineligible and eligible when they were combined, did not yield a positive signal. But when they looked at patients who were cisplatin eligible, it seemed like adding the nivolumab immune therapy to a chemotherapy backbone improved outcomes. So this is kind of interesting in a context of, chemotherapy, whether it's cisplatin gemcitabine or carboplatin gemcitabine, has been a backbone for the initial treatment of metastatic bladder cancer patients for almost 25 years now, and nothing has beaten it. There have been some things that have come along trying to, but they've not been able to show a significant benefit. We've not seen the full results of the study. This was just in the press release in July. There is a large international cancer conference coming up in 2 weeks, well, actually a week and a half now. The European Society of Medical Oncology, or ESMO, their annual conference is being held in Europe in a couple of weeks. And we're hoping that this will be presented there so that we can tease into this a little bit more about whether or not that should become or be considered, a new option for patients in the metastatic disease. So we'll need to see. And it's interesting, again, it's the first time we've sort of seen some positive results. So I think that's very encouraging. even if this does not become an option, if the FDA decides, well, maybe it's not strong enough, or it was only a subset, I think we stand to learn a lot about, biomarkers and other, sort of predictors of why did these patients do better or worse. So I think that's interesting. It's nice to see a positive result, even if it's in a subset, in the frontline metastatic disease where, it's been tough to move some of these new therapies up. So keep that, kind of in mind as a benchmark. We saw chemo plus nivolumab, an immune checkpoint inhibitor, seemed to demonstrate an overall survival and a delay in progression for cisplatin eligible metastatic patients. So that's a nice sort of framework to move on to for the next study that I want to introduce to you in terms of new results. The next study was the EV-302 trial, EV being the shortened abbreviation for the drug N42-mab vedotin, which is also known by the trade name of Padcev. This is pretty much fresh off the presses. Their press release that they issued was September 22nd, so only a couple weeks ago. And this trial, EV-302, was also conducted in the frontline metastatic urothelial cancer population. So these were chemo-naive patients who had not seen treatment for their metastatic disease. It enrolled patients who were cisplatin eligible and ineligible. It enrolled patients who had bladder primary urothelial cancers, as well as patients who had upper tract urothelial cancers. So really the full gamut of urothelial cancer in the metastatic setting, these were the patients who were enrolled in this trial. And this trial enrolled close to 1,000 patients, 990 patients. A little bit simpler schema. There originally were 3 arms, but the third arm was dropped very early. There were 2 arms that were essentially studied in this: standard chemotherapy, either cisplatin gemcitabine or carboplatin gemcitabine. Patients were randomized kind of evenly 1-to-1 to either standard chemotherapy, or the experimental arm in this trial, the EV-302 trial, was N42-mab vedotin, EV, plus the immune therapy medication pembrolizumab, which we've used, for urothelial cancer for quite some time here now in the metastatic setting. And this trial demonstrated also from the press release a significant benefit in improved overall survival and progression-free survival benefit in the patients who received the N42-mab vedotin plus pembrolizumab combination, when we compared that to the group that got standard chemotherapy. So we've been waiting the results of the EV-302 trial for about 2 years now. There has been a lot of enthusiasm for N42-mab vedotin, or EV, based on the success and the response and improvements that we have seen in patients with metastatic disease who had already received chemotherapy and already received an immune checkpoint inhibitor. This has been FDA approved in the United States now for about 5 years, based on the early results in the more heavily pretreated populations. And I think those of us who were part of those trials and have used N42-mab vedotin to treat metastatic patients since the initial FDA approvals can attest that the drug is very active. We see patients respond to it. We see patients respond who had not typically ever responded to treatments before. For instance, patients with liver metastases, bone metastases, patients doing well with pain symptoms relieved by treatment. But the big question was, would we be able to see this? Sorry, I'm going to move a little bit this way because of the sun. The big difference or question was, would this translate into improvements as we moved up into earlier lines of therapy? So if we move this up to patients who have never seen treatment in the metastatic disease, would this be able to beat chemotherapy head to head? And at least based on the press release, they've successfully, met that metric as the trial was designed. Now, this trial, we are also expecting to be presented in 2 weeks at the ESMO annual meeting in Europe. And I think, again, we're going to need to see the full results of the patient populations and what they got or what they didn't get after treatments. But I think with a positive overall survival benefit against chemotherapy head to head, I would say that it's likely that this will move into and become a standard option. I would estimate maybe in the next 6 months in the United States, maybe a little longer in Europe, because it usually takes a little longer in Europe to get those approvals. But I think this is a good thing. We've had chemotherapy for a long time. It raises many, many questions, and I'll kind of touch on that a little bit here before moving on to some other things about clinical trials. But one of the things with any clinical trial, when we see positive results when it comes out, we're always very enthusiastic about that. We're happy to see that. These clinical trials, when they're designed and when they begin, are typically designed based on what the landscape of therapy looked like 5 years ago. And sometimes when the clinical trials finish and read out positive, the landscape sometimes has moved or changed a lot. And sometimes that can put the results into a little bit different context. And so what are some things, for instance, that I will be looking at and want to see when that information is presented, in 2 weeks in Europe, and then ultimately when it's published? Well, when these trials began, and this goes both for the Checkmate 901 trial that I talked about, a few minutes ago with chemo plus Nivo, and for the EV302 trial with enfortumab plus Pembro, when those trials began, chemotherapy given for 4 to 6 cycles of treatment and then stopped, that was the standard of care. So there was no additional treatments given after the chemotherapy until a patient demonstrated progression on CAT scans or taken, every 2 to 3 months. What changed in the middle of these trials, to no fault of anyone, actually a good thing for the urothelial cancer community, is that we had, for the first time, a positive trial demonstrating survival improvements by using immediate maintenance immune therapy. So this is a trial we have talked about on this forum in the past, but it resulted in the FDA approval of avelumab, a PD-L1 immune therapy targeting agent, in the maintenance setting of metastatic urothelial cancer. And so what that did, at least for the care patterns in the middle of these trials, is that it no longer was considered standard of care to put a patient on chemotherapy for 4 to 6 cycles and then stop and wait for progression. What became the standard of care was give their chemo 4 to 6 cycles, and if they are not progressing, start immune therapy immediately. And so these clinical trials, when they first began, the Checkmate 901 and the EV302 trial, they did not have any mandate or provision to give maintenance immune therapy on the chemotherapy sort of standard control arms in the trials. Again, not their fault. It's just the way that the trials, pan out. So one of the things I will be looking at when we see this information presented is in the chemotherapy control arm, for patients that were randomized to that arm, does the overall survival of chemotherapy alone, does it look more like the overall survival looked 5 to 10 years ago, in a world in which we didn't give maintenance therapy, or subsequent enfortumab was not available, or sacituzumab, or erdafitinib, or some of the other agents we now have available? Or does it look more like a contemporary frontline overall survival, sort of metric? Did those patients who were on the control arm go on and get immune therapy? And if they did, was it immediately, or was it, in sort of sequence when they progressed? I do know that these trials were changed. They were amended sort of after the fact to try to allow for maintenance immune therapy in countries where it was approved, but it's difficult to do that. Sometimes, when you do that, 2/3 of your trial is already accrued, so that if you make that change, it may be too late to sort of have an impact on that control arm, if you will. Again, it's no fault of the clinical trial designs. I don't think I think it's still a great achievement for these to have reached that. And I do anticipate that the EV plus Pembro, I do think that probably will move into a frontline option for patients in the United States and likely in other parts of the world over the next 6 to 12 months as the companies making these medications do the appropriate filings and get their review. So we'll see. But I think it's a really exciting time to see this. We've gone a long time without seeing clinical trials in the frontline metastatic disease read out positive, and now we have 2 that have had positive results in a 3-month span. So I think that has immediate impact for our patients, in a positive way. And then I think it has an impact on clinical trials. Every time that we see a new positive trial that may change what is considered the new standard of care, there are a lot of ripple effects on, both trials that are currently being conducted but have not finished or not read out. Some may be fully accrued where they've enrolled all the patients, but they're still following them. But it may also have an impact on trials that are still accruing patients. So one of the things from a standard of care standpoint that I think about, and many people have thought about, is the enfortumab plus pembrolizumab becomes a new standard of care for frontline metastatic urothelial cancer patients. Then what happens to this maintenance immune therapy sort of approach that we have gotten used to in the last 3 to 4 years with sort of chemotherapy and avelumab, but it could also be with other immune therapies in that role. Does the maintenance role go away? Does maintenance immune therapy then become an important aspect of whatever a patient goes on to sort of for a second line treatment in metastatic setting? So if people get EV plus Pembro, and that's what most people start on in a new world, if they have progression on enfortumab plus Pembro, and we don't know yet what that next line of therapy will be, but if you look at things that are currently approved, you could treat that patient with platinum chemotherapy. You could treat them with an FGFR targeting agent like erdafitinib if they have an FGFR mutation. Or you might think about treating them with a different antibody drug conjugate like sacituzumab. All of those, are FDA-approved options, and there are more, that are probably coming. So if they've already had enfortumab plus pembrolizumab in the frontline setting for their metastatic disease, and let's say now they're switching to a new treatment agent, and for simplicity's sake, I'll just pick one. Let's say sacituzumab. So let's say they go from enfortumab plus Pembro, and doctor says, all right, it's not working anymore. I think we need to switch you to something else that's approved. Why don't we start sacituzumab? And by no way am I endorsing this as the preferred agent. It's just these are what's available, and I'm using it for sort of context. But then a major question now exists that didn't exist before is when we start someone on sacituzumab who has had prior exposure to an immune therapy agent like pembrolizumab, do we just put them on sacituzumab by itself? That's what it's FDA approved for. Or, does the immune therapy, if they're having progression on the enfortumab plus pembrolizumab backbone regimen, which agent are they actually resistant to? Is it both? Do they develop resistance to both agents? Is it only the enfortumab? Is it only the pembrolizumab? So one question might come up if we think that the primary resistance is to sort of the chemo like or targeted chemo like the enfortumab backbone. Some might think that continuing immune therapy might be helpful. Maybe we are stimulating the immune system still, and that's switching out sort of the targeted chemo backbone, the antibody drug conjugate like enfortumab, in place of a new medicine like sacituzumab, or you could even think of chemotherapy. Maybe we need to continue the immune therapy. So that's a brand new question. Nobody in the world has the answer to that. I bring that up on this forum in somewhat a little bit sort of self-serving, but just to highlight that clinical trial question exactly like that is being proposed at the national level through Eastern Cooperative Oncology Group by a good friend and colleague of mine, Monica Yoshi at Penn State, who is asking the question: if patients start sacituzumab, should they start sacituzumab alone, or should they continue a medicine like pembrolizumab? So I think when we see these new clinical trials and new results that are positive, it sort of, in some ways, resets the thermostat, where now there are populations of patients that will, I don't say be created, but they didn't exist before. So what does an enfortumab plus pembrolizumab progressing patient who got that in the front line, what is the best standard therapy? So you could think about a clinical trial randomizing patients between standard, carboplatin gemcitabine or cisplatin gemcitabine and sacituzumab, for instance. Just take the components themselves and see which one turns out to be better. Or you could ask some different things about combinations in that next sort of setting. So I think that's interesting. I think it's important that we figure it out. And I think when I think about clinical trials from the patient side, what I think is likely to happen is I think we're likely to go through a period of 2 to 5 years where we start seeing a wave of trials in sort of these new patient populations, trying to answer these questions about sequences of therapy. Does it matter? If everybody is going to get enfortumab plus pembrolizumab and everybody will then get chemotherapy, does the sequence really matter? And that's where some of the information being presented about these trials will be important. So did people on the chemotherapy control arms, did they eventually get, access to the experimental arms like enfortumab or like chemo and nivolumab? Did they cross over and get them, or did they never get them? And then I think, one of the things that will come up, and I mentioned this when I talked about the Checkmate 901 trial, we've been using this term cisplatin eligible and cisplatin ineligible for many years to talk about urothelial cancer patients in the metastatic setting, and then also around surgery like neoadjuvant chemotherapy. If enfortumab plus pembrolizumab becomes a standard of care for all patients in the frontline setting, we may no longer use the term cisplatin eligible or ineligible. Which way should I go? Move a little bit more this way. We may no longer be using that term as much, cisplatin eligible or ineligible, but it might be replaced, by a new term. Is someone enfortumab eligible or ineligible? It's a different drug, has different side effects, different limitations. One of its biggest side effects is neuropathy, when we use it for a long period of time. And there may be certain patients that we learn experience over time. If someone already has, diabetic neuropathy, where they already have numbness, in their feet and in their hands from their diabetes, is enfortumab a good fit for that patient? I can tell you in my own experience, I've treated diabetic patients, and I think, some caution is warranted, and I think you have to be, you just have to be on top of it a little bit more, and sometimes reduce doses and do things like that. And I think we'll get some experiences as time goes on. So some of the terminology, we may trade one for another: cisplatin ineligible, eligible, for EV eligible, ineligible, that kind of thing. Another thing that I think about from clinical trials as to what I think, our patient population is likely to see. Well, 10 years ago, we didn't have, multiple options, approved options for patients with urothelial cancer in the metastatic setting, and now we do. Well, that's a really, really good thing. It's great to be able to provide our patients options, but I think we've now come to a time where the need to identify, which patients benefit the most from specific options that are available, and that do not benefit from some of the other ones that are available is there. In other words, this need for biomarkers that we've talked about for a long time, I think it really is getting pushed to the forefront. It's not a luxury anymore. I think we have to really do the time and the studies with some of these trials that have been done to figure out who benefits from the drugs, but just as importantly, to figure out which patients don't benefit at all, from chemotherapy, standard chemo, or from pembrolizumab, or from enfortumab or sacituzumab, because we certainly don't want to put patients through, unnecessary side effects and toxicities that affect quality of life. But just as importantly, besides the quality of life aspects, due to the nature of urothelial cancer, we can't afford, to lose that time. If a patient goes from, being fairly symptom-free, but with some spread of their disease to lung or lymph nodes, and we put them on the wrong therapy and it has no chance of benefiting them, and we spend 2 to 3 months to figure that out, based on traditional CAT scans, or even as some of the liquid tumor DNA assays are coming about, they might not be the same patient 2 to 3 months later, when we've allowed sort of their cancer to continue to grow. They may be in a worse situation even when they move on to a drug that maybe they're best suited for. So I think our need to kind of to invest in these biomarkers, both at the discovery level at institutions like the Greenberg Bladder Cancer Institute, also on industry side in terms of them, in terms of bringing drugs to market for the right patients. And then I think from our government agencies, as far as funding, I think we really need to do that. And I think everybody does biomarker sort of investigations, but I think one of the things that is going to become critical for us and difficult for us, and probably not bias a lot of friends on the committees or folks that have to make these decisions, we're going to have to decide what not to do. There are some, there's some research and investigations that are done at many centers, across the world, and all of us do this, where as scientists, we're curious, we're interested, we want to get a first look, at a question. But I think the criteria and the standards for, what's ready and what's good enough to actually ask and invest, in a larger definitive biomarker sort of platform or investigation. I think the stakes are a little bit higher than maybe they were when we didn't have agents to choose from. So I think that's going to be on us as academic leaders and participating, in study sections and on advisory boards to both the government committees and our colleagues, and also our own personal decisions about where we spend our time, for us to be an active part of that. And then I have just two kind of last points that I'll talk about from a clinical trial standpoint, and then I'll open it up to questions because we've got a little bit of time here for sure. It's nice that we're seeing these 2 clinical trials show some benefit in the frontline metastatic urothelial cancer patients, but one of the questions that naturally comes up is, will this translate into equal or greater benefits if we move these treatment sort of combinations up even earlier, in the disease course and the disease stage, for our urothelial cancer patients? So one of the questions, we've got frontline metastatic. One of the questions that naturally comes up is, can we potentially benefit, or could we even cure more patients with muscle invasive bladder cancer? So patients who are facing, cystectomy or chemoradiation therapy into their bladder for muscle invasive disease? Can we improve upon the current sort of treatment approaches? And there are ongoing, randomized large phase 3 trials that are looking to try to answer this question. I would expect that we won't have the answer on those trials for probably another, I'd probably say 2 years at least, because some of them are still ongoing in terms of enrolling patients. But it's a natural question. And then if you take it a step further, even beyond muscle invasive bladder cancer, might we be able to move some of these new treatments up even into like high risk non-muscle invasive bladder cancer? And that's what some of the some of the makers of these drugs are trying to do. So with enfortumab vedotin in particular, there are the first phase 1 sort of attempts to look at giving this by intravesical administration directly into the bladder via catheter for high-risk non-muscle invasive bladder cancer patients. There's a whole lot of things that we have to kind of challenges and things we need to work through, in terms of some chemistry and pH and delivery and things when we give it in the bladder as opposed to IV. But I'm excited about that, to just see the possibility that we're seeing successes in the metastatic move up to muscle invasive and earlier. At least we're looking at this in the right way, and I think we'll be able to define whether or not there's legs to run with in those earlier populations. Still way too early, way too early to know whether that'll pan out or not. And there's a lot of other things that are being developed in terms of intravesical agents and things that are coming to market. So that's a rapidly moving sort of standard of care as well. But I think it's nice to see, just things moving up, and I think that offers promise and hope for our patients. And then lastly, for the ongoing trials that are being conducted, in metastatic patients, the impact of the Checkmate 901 and the EV302 results, I think each of those studies is going to have to look at how far into their study they are, and will a chemotherapy alone backbone, will that need to be modified? So in a metastatic setting, is chemo alone, is that an appropriate sort of control, or do protocols need to be modified, and the comparator needs to then be, enfortumab plus pembrolizumab or chemo plus nivo? We're going to have to see. I think some trials, quite frankly, depending on where they're at, they may or may not finish because they may look at saying they need a complete redesign and that they don't have the time to do that. Others may say, we're 90% accrued, so we just need to see where the data falls out. So I think you'll be hearing about that more. There'll be press releases, there'll be things from our advocacy groups, there'll be materials from our GBCI, there'll be presentations at meetings. But those would be things that I would kind of be looking for in the months, in the next 1 to 2 years to follow. So I kind of covered a lot there about frontline metastatic disease. I've talked before about non-muscle invasive, in previous, sessions with this group. Got about 15, 20 minutes, I think, for questions. At this point, I think I'll stop and pause for a second, and I think we'll bring David back on, and be happy to take any questions that the group, David or others have. So thanks a lot for the opportunity again.
Yeah, I enjoyed hearing that. No, it's always good to get your overview and opinions about these things. So Katie Hahn has a question. Are there specific biomarkers for upper tract urothelial cancer? If so, what are they?
Well, I think that's a good question. I would kind of answer it two ways. I don't know that I would say that there is a specific biomarker platform or technology that is unique to upper tract urothelial cancer, but I do think that there are some that have advantages, and then I do think that there are some biomarkers that are more enriched or more frequent in upper tract disease. So For instance, we've talked about it on this forum before about some of the exciting biomarker platforms that are looking at tumor DNA, in liquid form, whether it be in the blood or in the urine. And I think upper tract urothelial cancer, in my mind, really is one of the ideal places to look at some of the urine biomarkers to correlate that with sort of the tumor for a couple reasons. One is that the tissue, the ability to get tissue in the upper tract is sometimes limited. So if it's a small lesion in the middle of the ureter, not in the renal pelvis, not down in the lower ureter by the ureter orifice where it opens into the bladder, just due to sheer size and space, the instrumentation, it's sometimes hard via ureteroscopy to then kind of get a sideways biopsy to get actual tissue pieces. It can be done, and we do that. And we attempt to do that in everybody that we can. But I think the urine-based platforms offer a much maybe a much more practical way to get information in more patients. A lot of it's early, and I think we've had a lot of promising information presented in the last 1 to 2 years, and I think some of that's being worked into some of the upper tract trials right now. So my hope is that some of that will go from beyond proof of concept to demonstration of clinically meaningful utility and change the way that we care for patients. Beyond that, there are certain things that are more frequent. I think FGFR3 has been talked about a lot, and that we sometimes see, that more frequently in upper tract patients. We sometimes see, about 10 to 15% of upper tract patients have a inherited, cancer predilection syndrome called Lynch syndrome, and those patients may be particularly responsive to immune therapy. So I think it's a long-winded answer, but I think there's not a technology that I would say that is only, I think, ideally suited for upper tract, but I think there are certain things that are more frequent, and I hope will change our practice. Then I see another question from Doug. Could you restate the name of the med that you said was going into phase 1 trial in high-grade non-muscle invasive bladder cancer? Yeah, no problem, Doug. I was talking about actually enfortumab vedotin. So enfortumab vedotin, which I talked about in the context of the EV302 trial in metastatic urothelial cancer patients, they have a phase 1 trial that they are conducting right now. Currently, it is in BCG unresponsive non-muscle invasive bladder cancer patients. But they are conducting that right now to do two things. One, demonstrate, safety of it when given in the bladder. Number two, to demonstrate that it works. We'd like to see some complete responses, with administration in the bladder. And I think number three, which doesn't get as much kind of, I think, sort of hype, but I think is probably the most important part of the phase 1 trial, is trying to figure out what's the optimal way to give it. A lot of times when we talk about drugs given in the bladder, intravesical delivery is what I'm talking about. A lot of people just sort of cut paste BCG once a week, 6 weeks in a row. Then we look in 6 weeks and then decide about maintenance. And, with an antibody drug conjugate like, enfortumab vedotin, it's a totally different drug. Just because we're giving it into the bladder, it's a completely different drug. So we do need to figure out the right schedule, the right dose. And I think that's what they're trying to do in the trial. So, it's going to take us a little time to figure that out, but I think it's really exciting that they're starting it.
So Noah, Katie wonders why the chemo alone backbone in the clinical trials may be modified.
Well, to be truthful, I'm not sure that it will. I think a lot of this comes down to will the clinical trials that are in progress, if they have already enrolled, let's just say 75% of their target number of patients. So if they're going to enroll 1,000 patients and they've already enrolled 750, they probably won't be changed, because by the time that they modified the protocol, submitted it to the FDA, which they would have to do to get the design approved, and then opened it, they they probably would finish the trial. I think it's a bigger issue, I think, for trials that are early into their enrollment. So let's say if there's a large trial looking to enroll 1,000 patients across the world, and they're only at 200 patients, and EV plus Pembro becomes a new standard of care. In that situation, I think it would be very difficult and potentially, unethical if a new treatment was available. Like, you wouldn't be able to continue enrolling patients in the United States if EV plus Pembro became a new standard. So in that setting, those trials would have to be modified. But the hard part about a lot of this, in terms of, in our forums here and with patient forums, is that a lot of these decisions sometimes become a business decision, more so than a science or, a patient need question. And that's sometimes tough for a lot of us to see, including us, on the research side. I spend a lot of time and money, and and may not be able to answer a question if they close a trial early.
So Noah, Daryl's on the Colgenesis drug, and he's on the single arm monotherapy trial. I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit more about that drug and how enthusiastic you are about its potential going forward.
Yeah, I think it looks pretty promising. So, this is sort of a modified kind of viral product that takes advantage of sort of certain genetic changes in non-muscle invasive bladder cancer, in particular retinoblastoma alterations. But as a single agent, and Daryl's referencing the Bond trial, there have been a couple. They're all this is also interesting, sort of just gamesmanship. They're called the Bond trials because the drug's called CG0070. So they thought that was kind of slick. Let's call them all the James Bond trials, which I have to say, it actually is kind of a good marketing thing. But there's been a series of Bond trials, Bond 1, 2, 3, and some of these have been as single agents, and then there have been some that have been combined with immune checkpoints like pembrolizumab. I think what we're looking at in the CG007 sort of development is we're kind of trying to see where is it ultimately going to maybe land with clinical trial data that can come to the FDA and get it approved. I don't think there's any doubt now that they have treated, I think, probably close to 200, 300 patients that they've released the data on, that they can get complete responses, for instance, in BCG unresponsive patients. So the drug is active. Is it better, than, Adstiladrin, which was approved by the FDA almost a year ago, and we're still, coming to the market in terms of with the manufacturing? Is it better than gemcitabine and docetaxel? Not sure. The FDA, because of their data that they published in combination with pembrolizumab, sort of made them do a trial comparing sort of to pembrolizumab. So does CG007, when added to Pembro, does it really add more than Pembro by itself? And that might be problematic even if the trial is positive, if they're coupled to pembrolizumab and people are hesitant to give it. But I don't have any doubt that the drug is active, and I'm hopeful that they can come to sort of the FDA with a fully accrued trial with results that make that decision easier and say, yes, we should bring it forward. But it's going to be a little while to see if that happens.
So maybe building on that, looking at high-risk disease, non-muscle invasive disease, either BCG naive or BCG refractory, what's your level of enthusiasm for the current landscape, the agents that are populating it right now?
I'm pretty excited. I don't think we're looking at home run that changes that threat or need, ultimately for cystectomy, which is, I think, what our patient populations are looking at, where they say, look, I got to have another option. I mean, you're telling me it's not even into the muscle and we want to take the whole bladder out. That's still a tough pill to swallow in terms of messaging. I do think, though, that what we're seeing in the agents that have been approved, like Adstiladrin, and some that are being evaluated, in the last 4 to 5 years, we have seen some trials post complete response rate numbers that have been a lot higher than what we have seen with sort of the previous generation of intravesical or systemic attempts. So the benchmark used to be if you could get a complete response in a BCG unresponsive, heavily pretreated non-muscle invasive patient. If you got a complete response somewhere around the 30%, you were happy. That was an active drug. We're now seeing response rates when things are given in combinations that are starting to approach the 50 to 70% range. So that tells me two things I think that are encouraging is that we can get patients into a response. We weren't able to do that with as much frequency before. The question then will become, can we keep them in a response? Can the durability be extended without undue toxicity or high rates of progression, to muscle invasive or metastatic disease while we're kind of treating them? I'm optimistic that we can. We're going to have to continue to have our dialogues with the FDA about what the appropriate benchmark for success should be. How do we measure it? When do we measure it? And what I am encouraged by is I think with the number of trials that are ongoing, I think there are going to be a lot more clinical trial sort of data sets presented to the FDA so that it won't be a once every 5 years, let's come together, and talk about what we've learned. I think it will be an iterative and ongoing process.
And can you see any other exciting immune agents coming down the pike, either for advanced disease or for localized disease?
Well, I think, one of the things that gets me excited both clinically and then also on the scientific side of what we've learned about, metastatic muscle invasive, non-muscle invasive disease. I'm excited right now about sort of non-T cell targeting immune therapies. And that's a really, really broad topic, for our audience here. That basically means everything that's not a T cell, which when you add that up, it's probably twice as much as there is as far as T cells. And so some of the terms that you hear on the immune side, are, B cells, NK cells, dendritic cells, tumor-associated macrophages. I think in that area on the discovery side, I think we've gone beyond sort of proof of concept. We've seen, all right, these are important. They do modify, T cell responses. They do have direct anti-cancer killing properties independent of T cells in certain situations. Where our challenge is going to be in the clinical trial landscape across all states of disease is trying to figure out what patients really have a tumor and immune combination setup that, wow, their NK cells, are really exhausted, or they're primed and ready for an NK cell directed, type of therapeutic. I don't think that we're going to see some of these non-T cell directed therapies. I don't think we're going to see some landmark like we saw once every 100 years, like with PD-1, PD-L1, where you just throw it out there to everybody, and there's a dramatic move the bar in 20 to 30% of the patients. I wouldn't anticipate it, but I do think that we're going to learn how to get bigger benefits, maybe in the right patients.
In the past, we've talked about maybe using neoadjuvant clinical trials to speed up drug approvals. What's your opinion about that?
It really kind of depends on the FDA. There have been other disease states like breast cancer and things where neoadjuvants have resulted in FDA approvals based on pathologic complete responses. And there have been some workshops that the FDA has held with the bladder cancer community trying to look at, does pathologic complete response to a neoadjuvant regimen for urothelial cancer, is it really a true surrogate for a longer term outcome like disease-free survival, overall survival. I think we've done the first part of that, but I don't think we've hammered it home. I think the neoadjuvant phase 3 trials that are ongoing with immune therapy, immune therapy chemotherapy, EV Pembro, that kind of thing. I think what our academic community is going to need to do is, regardless of how those trials read out, if they're positive or negative, I think we really need to look at those data sets, the pathologic complete responses from those, and then actually look at, do we see true surrogacy with the longer term outcomes? Because if that happens, then I think we can actually come to the FDA and design trials in the neoadjuvant setting based on pathologic complete responses.
I
So I
agree.
think we can get there.
Yeah.
We got a little bit of work to do.
I agree. I think this may also be another case for liquid biopsies, but we're not quite ready for that yet. But okay, we're hitting the top of the hour. Does anybody else have any last question you'd like to ask? Well, seeing none, I'll thank Noah again for his time and insights, and all of you for joining us today. And hope we'll see you again next time. Have a great rest of the week, and let's do remember the people who are suffering in other parts of the world. It's a tough time right now for those people in the Middle East, especially. Take care, everyone.
Always a pleasure. Thanks, everyone.